Dr. Christian Peterson is from Ferris State University, and his expertise studying U.S. foreign relations, 20th century U.S. political history, Russian-Soviet history, and British imperialism. He received his bachelor degree from Yale University, his master's degree in the same subject from Utah State University, and his Ph.D. in history from Ohio University. He has authored books on Ronald Reagan and the anti-nuclear movements, and on globalization of human rights, private citizens, the Soviet Union, and the West. Dr. Peterson also has an extensive resume in the field of peace and conflict studies, particularly in the U.S.-Soviet engagement. His current project is a book titled Changing the World from Below, the transnational struggle for peace, human rights, and people's détente. Christian has been a great partner with us over the years, and on our Great Decisions series, he has advised us on the speakers, and he has annually taught his students on Ferris's campus with the Great Decisions program. We're grateful for that. Well, let's welcome Christian Peterson.
Thank you. All right, I'm very happy to be here today, and before I begin, I want to point out that not too many years ago, I got married, and my wife and I decided to get this wedding band to symbolize our connection with the world. And I'm pointing this out because near the end of my talk, I'm going to come back to this ring to help symbolize what it means to be part of the world on an International Day of Peace. So yep, she's got it too. We have matching bands that when you put them together, create the whole world together. And so thought I'd give a shout out to that. But the starting point for this talk is to conceive of to think about how we can think about what's going on in Ukraine today with the obvious terrible behavior of the Russian government in the war. And what I propose to do here is talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and I've decided to do my talk. I'm going to try to make 8 points about the conflict, and I'm going to try to keep those points to 5 minutes or so. I'm hoping I can do it very effectively, but I think that is going to be the best way to set us up to talk and then debate and then kind of look at what's going on from a number of different angles. So the first point that I would like to make to start off with is Ukraine is not Russia. Ukrainian Russians are not the same people. I don't know how many times I have to emphasize this and say it, because to many Americans, they don't necessarily know the difference between Russians and Ukrainians. I can think of many people who have asked me this question, including undergraduate students. Russian history and Ukrainian history are not the same. And you can go back to Mikhailo Hurovsky, who wrote a book in 1903. It's more of a pamphlet essay called The Traditional Scheme of Russian History and the Problem of a Rational Organization of the History of the East Slavs, where he made a scholarly argument that it's about time we start separating Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian history. And I make this point because the current leader of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, has a very distinct view of history. He cares about history, his vision of history. And I don't know how else to say this. I don't know how many articles I've read or how many scholarly treatments, newspaper articles where they say Putin cares about history, and what they should say, he cares about his vision of history. And if you want to know what Putin thinks about history in the world, read his essay that came out in July 2021 called On the Historical Unity of the Russians and the Ukrainians, where he, in almost no uncertain terms, connects Ukrainians and Russians as one people and comes pretty close to saying if Ukrainians don't think they're Russians, then they're going to have to be forced to learn the truth. And you don't think he cares about this? Look at this. In the mid-1800s, as a symbol of the emerging Ukrainian identity and history, Ukrainian history, like many other groups of people, especially in the Eastern Central Europe, begin to develop this national identity, national language, national history in the 1800s coming into the 20th century that many people have spoken about. And what they did is create a statue to Vladimir the Great, Vladimir in Russia, the Viking who came into Kiev and then converted to Christianity. He may have converted to Islam at one time, but he is often seen as the founder of the Slavic people, or the father of Ukrainians, Russians. And there's this statue here that has a very high pedestal and a 14-foot statue of Vladimir. And eventually the name is going to be taken. It goes through all this, so you get the Viking image, and then the name the Rus that comes from the Finnish language. In 2016, Mr. Putin decided we need a bigger statue. He built a statue of Vladimir the Great, the father of the Russian people, and he made sure it was 3 times as high as the actual statue here. The statue is like 50 feet tall. Like, I'm a bigger statue than you. He cares. And unfortunately, his view of history is completely wrong. I mean, I don't know how else to say it if you read it. I mean, if you're going to go through a crash course of Ukrainian history, Ukraine, what we think of today, or what we know as Ukraine today is a better way to put it. With the conversion of Vladimir, you have a society and civilization developed that we call Kievan Rus. Kievan Rus was a major player in the not only region, but it was well known in Western Europe. Princesses married into kingdoms like France. It was a series of decentralized, some you might say city-states, or might say different principalities that lived within a common framework under a king or a ruler. You have eventually churches are built. The Orthodox faith begins to emerge. There's a relationship with Byzantium. It's a complex, amazing history and a civilization that was known throughout what we would call the Muslim world, Western Europe. It's a proud, noble history, which I'm not doing justice to. But ultimately, what you have is the Mongols come and destroy it. Every historical account we have talked about just the amazing devastation that the Mongols did to Kievan Rus. Thousands killed. It's bloodbath of the Mongols, the whole Mongol strategy, surrender or we will kill you. And out of the Mongols comes the actual Ukrainian history. Russia has its separate history. The city of Moscow doesn't really enter the historical record till about 1147, 1150. Moscow made its name as the place of the most trusted tax collectors of the Mongols. But Ukraine, what we know as Ukraine, has a different history and a different trajectory. First, a lot of the lands that we know today as Ukraine come under the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Then, under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, after you have the merger of Lithuania and Poland in 1569, the kingdoms. This is important because it exposes certain people we're going to come to within the borders of Ukraine, exposes them to the Protestant Reformation. It exposes them to the West. It gives all these debates about what language should we go with. A lot of Ukrainian people end up in the Ukrainian borders, learn to read and write through Church Slavonic. But then you also have Latin, you have the Catholic Church intellectual tradition that comes part of it. Not only the Protestant Reformation, but I should say the Catholic Church intellectual tradition. And this leaves its mark on it. So why Moscow is expanding into Asia under people like Ivan the Terrible and so forth, you have this whole kind of series of competition between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, called Muscovy, which eventually we were going to think of as the Russian Empire. You've got the Ottoman Empire in the south, which is more or less aligned with, or technically the suzerainty over, the Crimean Khanate. And you have this whole complex interactive history. And that is where you bring in Bohdan Khmelnytsky, 1595 to 1657, of the Zaporizhian Sich. A lot of it to talk about there. Now, to understand what's going on here, to make sense of someone like this, you have to understand that when many Ukrainians were under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, they were turned into serfs. They were for lack of a better word, became peasant. They were taxed. Their produce was taken from them. They were not exactly thrilled to be part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And this is developing to the south in areas like this. You have the so-called various, for lack of a better word, proto-states of the Cossacks begin to develop. The Cossack is a Turkish word for free person or freebooter. You have freebooter, excuse me. And what you have here is the situation where you have the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. You have people developing their kind of own, the Cossacks developing their own independent proto-states. Then you have Muscovy here. And someone like Khmelnytsky wanted out of the unequal relationship within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And he looked for allies to fight. He started with the Crimean Tatars. They proved to be not great allies. They left him on the battlefield 3 times. He needed a buddy. That is when he went to Muscovy. And ultimately, they made this agreement, the Pereslav Agreement of 1654, where, as representative of the Cossacks, through this Zaporizhian Sich, and the Sich is kind of like a clearing, a cut. It was like a place where you put down your fort and you defended your land. Zaporizhian has, I've read many different translations, but it tends to be like a rapids or some type of like free area. And at the end of the day, he made what many people have taken to be an oath to Muscovy, to team up with them against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And it's not clear, if you go through the history, what exactly that meant. Because Khmelnytsky and others thought it meant that we will give an oath of allegiance to the Tsar, but we will have a lot of autonomy to live as we want. Muscovy tended to be, we are czars, we are God's representatives, we will tell you what to do. So right off the bat, they're not all on the same page. And what ends up happening out of this is you have Khmelnytsky and others forge kind of an entity called the Cossack Hetmanate, which was really, it's kind of hard to describe, but the way things went down is that on this side, on the left, or the okay, here it is. So to the left here, the land of the Hetmanate was technically under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They tried to exercise authority over it pretty quickly. On the other side, including Kiev, it was under the control of Muscovy. And to make things even more complicated, at times and places, the Ottomans came up and took portions of territory in what is now Ukraine. So you have this whole complex array of Cossacks trying to figure out who to align with. You've got empires fighting. The Ukrainian people that we know as the Ukrainian people do not have a chance to make their own state. One of the things you're going to see, the Ukrainian people are looking for an opportunity to have their own borders, to have their own nation. And it's not exactly easy, especially when you're in an area here that many considered the breadbasket of Europe, one of the breadbaskets. Going back to the ancient Greeks, people literally thought this region was the central breadbasket that they needed to feed their empire. And so as you move from the 1800s into the 1900s, you have a situation where ultimately, late 1700s, you have the Prussians, the Austrians, and the Russians carry out these partitions. So a lot of what we think of today as being part of Ukraine is going to go under Austrian rule. Muscovy is going to take, or the Russian Empire after Peter the Great, is going to obviously control a lot of what becomes the Ukrainian borders as part of their expansion. But the Ukrainian identity and nationalism is going to develop, especially in the Austrian-controlled, within the confines of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So you have some Ukrainians who are living with the Austro-Hungarians, you have some living under Russian control. And then the major moment, and I'm skipping over a bunch of cultural development, literature development, but what ends up happening is Ukraine seems to have finally get its chance to have its own state because of World War I and the collapse of the Russian monarchy. You see Ukrainian people create the Ukrainian People's Republic and the West Ukraine's Republic, which was centered in the part of Ukraine that was controlled by the Austrians. They get involved in a complex civil war with the Bolsheviks, the White Armies, the Poles. I'm not sure how many people know that Ukraine and Poland fought a pretty brutal war during this time period over borders between Poland and Ukraine. And that's going to come back when we talk about World War II, that the Polish people, the Polish nation ended up winning. But ultimately, Ukraine is going to be snuffed out, mostly by the Bolsheviks, by the Soviet creation of the USSR. But what's interesting to me about this time period is one of the persons that does not always get play in the history is a guy named Pavlo Skorobdasky, hetman of the Ukrainian state, which basically was installed by the Germans. The Germans came in as part, after the Brest-Litovsk Treaty and so forth, they came in and they tried to use Ukraine as a breadbasket to feed their army. And they put this guy in control, trying to dismantle the Ukrainian People's Republic and West Ukraine's People's Republic, which ended up merging in 1919 to try to get a common front. But what's interesting about this guy who looks, I'm kind of impressed with how he's dressed here. He did a lot for the Ukrainian nation, founded universities, founded schools, literature, created diplomatic consulates abroad. He is often underestimated for the way that he put the institutions of a Ukrainian state into practice, despite being this conservative guy who did not like all these other Ukrainians because they thought they were communists or socialists or crazy anarchists. But it doesn't work. The Ukrainian independent country does not come to pass. The Ukraine enters the Soviet Union. Which comes to my point two. Another thing you'll see in the literature, and Putin runs with this, my friends, runs with this. I mean, it's annoying to listen to, but the argument is Ukraine is not simply a Soviet Bolshevik creation. The Soviets, and Lenin in particular, created Ukraine's borders to recognize the realities on the ground. It was not the other way around. He did not just artificially make up the borders of Ukraine. He did it to recognize what people on the ground thought of. They were trying this whole era of Wilsonian self-determination, and the Bolsheviks had their arguments between Stalin and Lenin over how to treat nationalism, but at the time, it was very much considered, we are reacting to what's on the ground. We are not creating something artificial. So Ukraine, Soviet Republic goes online. A lot of Ukrainians that are going to end up within the borders of modern Ukraine, at least before the Soviet, Russian invasions recently, are going to be in different places. Some Ukrainians are going to be living in Polish borders. Some Ukrainians are going to be living in Romanian borders, in Bukovina. Some Ukrainians are going to be living in the country of Czechoslovakia. That's where you get the name Ruthenian from. You begin to see many Russians treating these Ukrainians as our little brothers, our little kind of like people that we don't really need to pay that much attention to. We're the big brother, they're the little brother. I don't have time to get into it, but there is so much Russian literature, culture that just kind of dumps on the Ukrainian identity in the 1800s, 1900s. But I think this is a good point to reinforce the issue of how Ukraine left the Soviet Union, because Putin has a lot to say on this subject. But to suffice it to say here, Ukrainians left the Soviet Union because they wanted to. Especially after the failed coup against Gorbachev, you have a situation where in August 24th, 1991, the political authorities that are left within Ukraine, within the Soviet Communist Party, vote to leave the Soviet Union. It's an almost unanimous vote to leave the Soviet Union. There is a popular referendum in December 1991. The Ukrainians, I don't remember, I'm not good at remembering numbers, but something like 95% of Ukrainians, why 92? Even better, 92%. I don't want to be accused of inflating. 92% of Ukrainians voted to leave. And this statistic, I think I do remember correctly. 57% of the people on the Crimean Peninsula voted to leave the Soviet Union. So it wasn't like they were dying to get back into Russia necessarily. And so what I'm getting at here is then you have the whole situation with the Budapest Memorandum and the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons based on the promises that were made in the Budapest Memorandum, which was an agreement with Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan. It was signed by the United States, China, Great Britain. France was a little, I'm going to say this, wishy-washy. They signed separate agreements. But the thing of it was, what I find interesting about this agreement is it has all the right language. There was a lot of economic aid put into Ukraine. There was a lot of good language. You don't need nuclear weapons to protect your security. We're going to guarantee your security. But the big loophole that we see now, and I'm not sure, you can't really go back to history and do you think this is what Yeltsin was thinking or somebody else? But the loophole was you can use force against Ukraine in the name of self-defense. There was a self-defense clause that supposedly was going to be used to justify the use of aggression. And there's no doubt in my mind when he ripped it up, the way that he's framing things, Putin, he's not stupid. He read it. I'm sure I've heard him go back and forth how the Budapest Memorandum didn't matter. And at the end of the day, it's still, we have the right to defend ourselves. And we'll get into how he justified the invasion. He, like a lawyer, went after that document. Point 3, Ukraine is not a Nazi fascist state. Russia, oh my God, should say is more fascist than Ukraine. Missing an is. Fair enough. But I think you get what I mean here. And so, I'm not sure, I've studied this to the best of my ability. My reading in Russian is not the greatest. I can still not find the exact definition of what this symbol means. This is supposed to symbolize the Russian war effort. Was it victory, the West? It's all these types of different things.
West.
What?
West.
West. So you think that was your guess? Are you? No, I mean, I don't know. I'll take your word. I mean, to me, it's almost gone beyond this. People now just see it and symbolize it with the Russian war effort. And you've got all these arguments in scholarship about the Russian relationship with fascism. There's various words for it, rashism, swastika. You see all this stuff. But to get at this topic, I think you have to have some context about World War II. Because a lot of what people argue about Ukraine, it comes from World War II, but it has a long history, and I'll tie it all together here. To understand World War II, you obviously have to understand the Holodomor. This terrible man-made famine, where the worst effects of it were in Ukraine. Putin has tried to play it, everyone suffered, and everyone did suffer. I don't want to be misunderstood. But we know from the documentation, the works of Robert Conquest and others, that Stalin wanted to teach Ukraine a lesson. I mean, when people wouldn't be tied to their collective farms and this Ukrainian identity out there, he wanted to make Ukraine the textbook Soviet republic. And anytime there was talking about this terror famine or hunger famine, Stalin was basically like, it's all a conspiracy, it's all nonsense, just take the food and people died. About 4 million, 5 million, depending on whose statistics you find the most believable. But it's in the million. And you could tell the mindset of Putin, I'm kind of giving a little preview here, based on the behavior of Malina Rudenska, who was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in what we think of today as Western Ukraine, the Poland area. She was a Polish politician, a well-regarded feminist, scholar, I mean, she did tons of different things. She was known as an international mover. And she went out of her way to try to draw international attention to the terror famine. And eventually she'd end up in the West, in the United States and Canada. But the moment she did this, and she went into left-wing circles, right-wing circles, and said, Stalin's killing people. And what did the Soviet government call her? Nazi. They put an international campaign out to basically equate any criticism of the Soviet Union with Nazism. And her exhibit number 1 was this woman right here, who's obviously not a Nazi. She was part Jewish, for starters. So when you have the Nazi-Soviet pact, when you have the beginning of World War II, there were some Ukrainians who did not see much trouble collaborating with the Nazis. There is a long history of anti-Semitism in the lands within the borders of Ukraine today. One of the worst, I didn't mention it earlier because I thought it'd be better to connect it here. During the uprising of Khmelnytsky against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, there were mass pogroms that killed tens of thousands of Jews. And one of the reasons that they were done is because the Polish landlords, and I'm not justifying it, I'm just trying to give you context to understand it. The Polish landlords often turned Jewish people into the tax collectors, the overseers on the estates. They made them kind of like, it's almost like how the rich British people with their slave plantations in Jamaica had someone else do the overseeing and collect the money, while they had their palatial estates in wherever, Edinburgh, I don't know. But the point of it is, that did not endear the Jewish people to the Ukrainian peasants, especially during the uprising. And of course, there is anti-Semitism, I don't want to be misunderstood, but these things have long histories behind it. And so the symbol of this kind of uprising and collaboration with the Nazis is this guy right here, Stephen Bandera. And Stephen Bandera was part of an organization of Ukrainian nationalist Group B, which was the more militant nationalist group. This is founded in the late 1920s, and eventually put together the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. To my mind, this is a subject that just is conducive to the complexities of history. This is a guy who collaborated with the Nazis. Some of the people aligned with him and in his circle definitely carried out attacks as part of the Holocaust against Jews. What I think is less well known is that he tried to ethnically cleanse Poles from regions that he thought should be part of a post-war Ukrainian nation state that had all Ukrainians. This is still a matter of contention in this scholarship between Polish and Ukrainian historians about how many Poles were killed by Ukrainians during this time period. Some say 100,000, the Ukrainians say 10,000. They argue. But what I find interesting about his life is that, in 1939, he was in prison because he killed a Polish government official. He was let out of jail. The Nazis trained him. They trained some battalions. Right after the Nazis kind of let him go, he declared an independent Ukraine. The Nazis ended up arresting him again and cracking down on a lot of the Ukrainian insurgents because they were not with the program. The Nazis did not see an independent Ukraine part of their racial utopia. And in fact, he does not really make it back to Ukraine during the war. And he's going to end up in West Germany, killed by Soviet agents. So in many ways, I think he's an overrated historical figure. Because he was a lot of the stuff. When I was learning this stuff, I thought he was in the midst of it in the war fighting, but a lot of times he wasn't. He was in jail or walking around looking for action. In fact, the historian that I studied under at Ohio University wrote something for the History Network where the CIA, after the war, thought about maybe working with him or picking his brain about to go after the Soviets, and the CIA analysts are like, this guy's crazy. Like he thinks he's like the next Jesus Christ or something. He doesn't understand reality. Because he had this idea of leading an army through Moscow and all this stuff. But it's still, to my mind, an important moment to kind of grapple with some of the complexities of this. Because it's an easy card to play. And I don't want to downplay anti-Semitism, ethnic cleansing. It's bad. It deserves to be criticized. But we need context and perspective. For my best research, and people tell me if I'm wrong, I'm willing to be corrected. The best research that I can do on this subject, that I did for this talk, about 250 to 300,000 Ukrainians actively collaborate with the Nazis. 7 million fight for the Red Army. More Ukrainians die fighting the Nazis than Americans, British, and French put together. Is that getting Putin's description of the war? Ukrainians, obviously you can criticize this, but their contribution to defeating the Nazis deserves to be at least acknowledged. And I don't know, the last time I checked the numbers, roughly 15 million Ukrainians died from 1929 to 1945. 15 million. So to me, to focus on someone like Bandera, who rightfully deserves to be criticized, we should not lose sight of the larger picture. One more point on this subject. The infamous Azov Battalion. At the end of the day, the Azov Battalion was founded in 2014 by a Ukrainian right-wing figure called Andrei Belitsky, who was also in parliament from 2014 to 2019. It had foreign recruits. It had a reputation of attracting Ukrainians from groups like the Right Sector and Nazis and all this stuff, and it's gotten a lot of play. When I gave a talk at my school about the war in Ukraine, the first question on the Zoom chat was, doesn't the Azov battalion prove the Ukrainians are a bunch of Nazis? And the answer is no. At the end of the day, first off, we're talking roughly about 2,000 people out of tens of thousands in the Ukrainian army. Almost from the beginning, Belitsky left pretty quickly. The Nazi S symbol was done away with pretty quickly. The best research I can do on the subject today is that maybe 5-10% is right-wing within the group. It's mostly Russian speakers around Mariupol. And if you look at the grand scheme of things, since 2010, the appeal of right-wing parties in Ukraine has consistently gone down. In 2019, Svoboda, which is supposed to be this collection of right-wing parties marshaling their strength, including some parties that in the past have gotten the label neo-Nazi, won about 2% of the vote. And they've gotten rid of their emblems. To me, you can criticize Ukrainians as you would anybody for examples of anti-Semitism and hatred. And I hate to play this card because I often think it's a dodge, but we have plenty of hatred and groups and militias right here in this country, right here in this state. I drive through upstate New York to see my kid. I see all sorts of emblems I can only describe as Nazi-esque and militia-esque on I-80 and off the roads on I-80. So to me, that is not any type of clincher. And as far as Russia, I was going to do more. I don't have enough time. But the people that Putin reads and the parties in Russia have a very interesting relationship with fascism. Many articles I've read suggest Putin loves this guy, Ivan Ilyin, who more or less, when he was alive, he was a white, after the Russian Civil War, a guy who was sympathetic to the white, that went abroad and talked about how Russia should be emulating and acting more like countries like Mussolini, fascist Italy, Hitler. He thought Ukrainian had no right to statehood and Ukraine needed to be eradicated. And then there's guys, I'm only going to show you one more to move the time along, but the guy that really stands out to me, he's now dead, but this guy who wrote the book Third Empire, Russia as It Ought to Be, by Mikhail Yuryov, who's a member of this party that's still kicking called the Eurasia Party. And what I find interesting about his book is it's part of this whole philosophy that I can only describe as fascist inspired. It's this whole vision of tearing down the American empire. Russia is going to be a land empire who is going to use its power, nuclear weapons. It's going to use its strength to destroy the liberal conspiracy of America and its flashy sea power. Americans have been seduced by this LGBT community or LGBT conspiracy to make Russian men weak, to make our society weak with their values of consumption and consumerism. It's a whole line of thought that if you study intellectual history, you call Occidentalism. There's a couple books on the subject. And what I find amazing about this guy was when he wrote this book and he gave his speeches, he openly said, we should use our nuclear weapons to blackmail Americans because they're afraid of dying. They'll give up. We're not. We're the Russian soul. And this was the praise that I got from one of his novels that just stands out to me. And you don't obviously have to read all of it, but like the crescendo is when this happens this is like in the 2050s when Russia has vanquished the American empire. Representatives of the American elite, George Bush, the presidents, Clinton, all of them are passed through Red Square in shackles with nameplates around their neck. The Russian government was letting its own citizens and the whole world know that Russia had fought and vanquished not only the American army, but American civilization. All these guys have variations of this type of argument. Probably the most other famous one is Alexander Dugin, who 2 days ago I did a bunch of research on him. In many different ways, he could not stop talking about how he appreciated Mr. Trump, our former president. That he was going to turn American civilization around, hopefully. So when you get into all this stuff about Putin's rhetoric, the thinkers, the behavior of the Russian government, its on and off relationship with Nazi groups like OB, 88, Nashi, RO, and the Russian imperialist movement, I'd be more worried about fascism in Russia than I am I'm more worried about Russian fascism than I am about Ukrainian. Which brings us to point 4. What is Putin thinking? To my mind, Putin is mixing a lot of different things in a vision that is predicated on empire, a backward-looking view of history that has elements of Leninism, Stalinism. This is what we were talking, I think you're 100% right. This whole idea that we are going to make Russia great based on these visions of the past. And I also would throw in there, he's also very concerned about domestic politics. I think he understands that in his mind, Russia's never going to be the United States in terms of its economic achievements and the way it goes. He saw the color revolution. He does not want to have examples of anything approaching liberal, democratic, successful states on his border. I think that you have to throw into that. I mean, why else do you decide to just poison people who are running for office next to you? Did you remember the Yushchenko poisoning from the dioxin? I mean, to my mind, it's hard to pin down everything that Putin believes. But I do think it's a combination of a bunch of different factors rooted in a view of Russia that's predicated on going back to past glory, that the best way to get a nation state more respected in the world is not by becoming a more liberal democratic society, it's rebuilding a Russian empire. And it's better for his domestic side too. I can say more about that during question and answer. I didn't get to every point I wanted, but I know we have to move along. Point 5. The Orange Revolution and Maidan Revolution's revolution of dignity are not conspiracies or function of U.S. interference. They're not CIA jobs. They're, as Putin and lots of people, even in this country, frame it as, the CIA just moved a few pieces and everything was done away with. I find them incredibly inaccurate. The Maidan Revolution was a popular revolution inspired by Yanukovych's behavior. He reneged on a deal that not only the Rada had approved, but that a lot of people, especially generationally, expected it. A lot of young Ukrainians see their future in the West, see it as a more democratic society. They don't see it in some vision of a rebuilt Russian empire with Mr. Putin at the top as this kind of newfound czar. They're looking to Brussels, they're not looking to Kazan. And so to frame it, it's incredibly insulting and to me, dangerous just to say, oh, the CIA. It's very inaccurate and it actually, what's the word I'm looking for? Astounds me. And we can get in. I'm going to save it for the question and answer. I can go on and on about Victoria Nuland too and her phone calls and all that stuff if you want to talk about it. Point 6, I believe Russia is guilty of any number of war crimes, and I would go so far as to accuse them of attempted genocide. And I don't make this charge lightly. If you look at the rationale that the Russian media and Putin himself have gave, I don't know how else you can look at it. I mean, Putin basically made it very clear, and it's in Russian publications, they wanted to decapitate the Ukrainian elite. I mean, to me, it sounds almost at times, the language sounds very similar to how Hitler talked about Czechoslovakia. It's an artificial creation, an artificial elite. We get the top off, people will be happy to live under our rule. I mean, all this stuff. I mean, this is in Ria Novsta. What should Russia do with Ukraine? Liquidate the Ukrainian elite. Get rid of the name Ukraine. Re-educate Ukrainians. De-Ukrainization of Ukraine. Isn't that what Russia's doing on some level? Changing all the street names, getting rid of teachers, moving children around. I mean, there's so many examples of it. And this is where I base this on. I've got all maps and stuff on war crimes, but if you look at going back to the Genocide Convention, I think the most dangerous thing you can do is think that genocide has to be a certain number, because it doesn't reach 6 million. If you look at Raphael Lemkin, who failed to get cultural genocide as a separate category for many reasons, But in the UN genocide, it says, any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily harm, all the way down, measures intended to prevent births within the group. To me, Russia is moving in that direction or is already there. And I like how Christina Hook put this in a Foreign Affairs article in July 2022. How she summarized why she calls it a genocide as well. How am I doing on time? Okay, I'll end it. I was going to make another point. My final 2 points were this. Why I don't think peace is likely anytime soon. We can talk that more during our discussion. But I do want to try to say why I think this war matters. So humor me for 2 minutes. I think the most important reason it matters comes back to this. The wedding band that I bought on Etsy with my beautiful wife. The people who made these rings were from Ukraine. And this is the message they sent us after the invasion, and when people were asking them, what can we do for you? These Jews, they made, even my stupidity, I lost my ring, and they gave me another one for like half price. My stupidity. So what is going on here, to make this real simple, you have a situation where he's off fighting, she's a refugee in Poland, and they're basically said, we don't want charity, we want work. The people in Poland are helping them maintain being jewelers. We need to win this war for people like this. I mean, I can't think of more brave and just inspiring people. Makers of my wedding ring. Wedding band, however you want to call it. So I think at the end of the day, we have to win the struggle for the principle of liberal democracy, to defend what's left of our liberal world order, to reinforce right and wrong and that there's still truth. Putin is a master of nihilism, lying, and deceit, and he preys on people to be cynical and just kind of wash their hands of things. We need to give a shit. He lies with almost impunity, and he thinks he can get away with it by turning truth into a matter of power or to truth into something I can use in a way that appeals to people who hate something. And I'm not saying that as clear as I could, but what he's really saying is I will manipulate things that confirm people's worst passions and ideas. It will be a victory for the European project of integration to keep the EU going, not going back to the dark days of empire that Europe, we thought, got out of in 1945, at least the war making. But in a broader sense, and this is where I'll end, I also think it's a good thing. It gives us a chance to move away from the hydrocarbon world we live in. One of the only reasons this man has power is because our addiction to oil, gas, and whatever. This is our opportunity now to use it as an excuse to get off this stuff. And we can maybe prove, based on the behavior of Zelensky or that image of that girl who was singing, what's the Disney, Let It Go, and the Ukrainian girl singing in Russian, that multiracial, multi-ethnic societies can function and they can be stronger and better than what Putin is offering us. And that's, I'll end. Thank you. Yeah.
Professor Austin, Putin, if he knew about you, he wouldn't sleep so well.
I think I could take him in judo. I really do.
semi-mobilized nation. And just I think yesterday, he again threatened the West with nuclear attack.
Mm-hmm.
8th or 9th time, maybe accusing us of doing that. So I realize you're an historian, no one can predict the future. But what do you think is the most likely outcome? If Ukraine just pushes Russia, all the way back to the border, then what?
So you're saying what's the most likely outcome, like when this is all said and done, or coming in the coming?
Especially if the war continues to go well for Ukraine.
What I think is going to do, and I didn't show this slide, but a couple days ago I was talking to my friends, my wife. I said within a day or two he's going to announce referendums. And once he does that, he is going to try and bluff the use of nuclear weapons. At this point, I can't rule anything. I'm not going to say he won't use nuclear weapons, but I have a hard time in my mind seeing how they would facilitate a lot of his goals other than just bluffing. So at the end of the day, what I think is, to me, I can only think in scenarios. Right now, I think Ukraine is going to keep going and is going to be doing well. The big wild card to me is how the energy thing goes in the winter. If he keeps getting support and Europeans support him, Americans stay on board, I think Ukraine can fight and win until, the Russian elite decide this is enough. As Tracy and I were talking about earlier, a lot of educated Russians want out now. If it keeps going and keeps going badly and Ukraine holds its own, I could see somebody literally moving Putin off to the Russian equivalent of the Leader Nut House. I don't know how to describe it. So to me, it's not going to end anytime soon. To me, I can see fighting now within a year even, assuming that things don't crack because of the winter. I would really like to look in a crystal ball and know what energy prices are. Because ultimately, even Americans, let's say the November elections, it's going to be hard to keep sending Ukrainians what they need if oil is $220 a barrel and inflation what it is. And we already can see with some of the rhetoric, we're not helped by our former president at all on this, but that some of the rhetoric is people are already beginning to question, we've given all this money. The Americans have given roughly $54 billion in aid, about 15 million in military aid. Ukraine is having a hard time raising the money and infrastructure to get the war production going. So I'm not giving you the best answer. My gut answer would be I don't know. But I don't see any reason for right now why Ukraine can't keep going and really make things miserable for Russia. I heard an interview, a podcast today with the colonel in the Ukrainian army, and he said their whole strategy is not so much to take back territory, but really make it impossible for Russians to resupply. They're taking strategic points. They want to just basically make the Russian war effort as much of a pain in the ass as possible, so eventually they'll see that they can't win and give up. But the problem is Putin is a stubborn man who's 70 years old and sees his complete legacy as this new vision of Peter the Great or whatever. He's not giving up anytime soon. So my gut would tell me that it's going to get ugly, bad, and it's going to be like the famous Hemingway quote, how did you go broke, gradually, then suddenly. Everyone's using that quote, but I literally think it's going to be something like that. I can't think of a better way to put it. Any other questions or comment? Yeah.
If Putin's interfered in our affairs so much online, sowing distrust amongst our people, what did he do with the Ukraine? What did he do prior to this war? Has he created an anti-vaccine community there? What is the effect there?
He's done a bunch of cyber attacks. He's cut off power. Russia messed with the election results. And what was that? The years? Is it 2000? Was it 2016? I should know this off the top of my head. But they've messed with a bunch of stuff in Ukraine. And of course, there's been the war going on before this one, the 2014 invasion, which his response to the Minsk Accords was basically we're not a part of this, we're not in it, even though clearly Russian troops were part of it. he has this sense from what I can study, and I'm willing to hear more thoughts on it. I literally think he thinks that democracy is all bullshit. It's all a bunch of lies. You can hear this in the RT people who talk about America. Like, I mean, when they have these arguments with Americans about government, they'll just say, it's all bullshit. You just pretend you're not fraudulent. You pretend it's not like a game. Everyone knows your system's corrupt. Everyone just pretends it's not. We're real people. We don't pretend. We admit it out loud. Reminds me of like the Germans used to say that about the British during the late 1800s, early 20th century. You pretend to be principled and nice, but you hammer people. So we're going to build battleships and hammer people too. But so you start from that assumption is they will try anything to take advantage of the fissures within these societies. So they see our disputes, which are clear. It's very easy to manipulate them or exacerbate them, might be a better way to put it, by throwing in money on the Facebook or doing all this stuff. But at the end of the day, we're only as weak as we are divided. I mean, there's no reason they should be able to cause such havoc for something like the Women's March in D.C. by pretending to be African-American feminists calling the leader of the march like basically a Jew hater. I mean, that caused a lot of trouble. People like thought these were like real posts and then like went after a bunch of the leaders of that march. So my point is, it wouldn't be an issue if we got our house together. But that doesn't seem to be that easy. Like, Russia can't hurt us, but they can make things a lot worse if we don't get our stuff together, because they're putting a message that people want to believe. I mean, I have relatives. I'm from Minnesota. I grew up in suburban Minnesota. A lot of my relatives live in southern Minnesota near Rochester, Austin area, a town called Blooming Prairie. I go to my family gatherings, and they will say things that puppet Russian propaganda on any number of levels. They think it's legitimate. I mean, they want to believe it. Like, there's a conspiracy. Like, there are people that, like, I have cousins who believe in QAnon conspiracy theories, or that the election was stolen. And they think I'm a dupe. So, I guess my point on this is, we have to get ourselves in order. We have to get our society and show that it works. Ukraine, I mean, I don't want to speak for Ukrainians, but the people I talk to and I know, they want to have something resembling a liberal democracy. And they realize they're fighting corruption. Ukraine has been an incredibly poorly governed, corrupt country with anti-Semitism. It's not a perfect place, but they want to get into the fight. There are people that want to get into the fight, and if we're just going to sit here and say it's all bullshit, how are we going to inspire them? I don't know. Yeah.
I really appreciated you going through Ukrainian history, because, like most Americans, I'm not familiar with it. Do you think that that shows us why the Ukrainian people have been so amazingly resilient? I think we've all admired what they've been about and how they've been able to sustain what's been going on. So is this like a historic pent-up opportunity now for them to, declare that we are Ukrainians?
I think so. I mean, I can't remember where I read this or I heard it in a speech. Somebody explained the difference between Russia and Ukraine. Russia is a vertical society. It's boom, boom, boom. It's you look up. It's all Ukraine, horizontal society, where people have not always had the state structures, they've not always had the government, they've had to work together, they've had to find ways to survive, they naturally get together. Like, I don't know how many, all of us here are people that connect to the world. The stories of how people have worked together, made supplies last, taken care of each other without question, had the ability to work in small groups in order to survive amongst strangers. They don't need to be told what to do. They have this natural ability to go out and not expect orders from above, but to take care of things through civil society and all these other types of arrangements. So to me, that's inspiring. But what also I think should inspire people is the ability that the fact that a lot of times, a lot of the Ukrainians who are dead set to remaining Ukrainians are native Russian speakers. Like Zelensky, to me, is an amazing figure. Like, before this invasion, people thought he was a failed, dopey kind of prime minister, a former comedian. I even watched some of his shows on Netflix. It's like slapstick. It's like it's like Benny Hill's show at times. I'm old enough to remember Benny Hill. Yeah. But now, I mean, the way that he goes back and forth amongst languages, and that the people who speak Russian, who Putin thought was like his natural ally, want to be Ukrainian. They don't want any part of Russia. I think we can really think about that in terms of the future of identity. I mean, I would be, not that my language skills are limited. I can read some languages, but I don't speak any. But if we could live in a country where you could not even think about going to, say, French or Spanish, like they go from Ukrainian to Russian. Imagine how you could make a country function better if you didn't get caught up on the identity that comes with language. To me, that's inspiring. So I think this is the chance to the Ukrainian people to show we're not Russian, want to be Russians. We have our own history. We're a society where people can figure out things from themselves, help themselves, fight against great odds. So that's how I see it. Yeah.
Based on your education in history and government, do you foresee a dramatic change in post-Russia war in their government, anything like that?
After Putin dies or is removed from power?
Let's say the war ends and Ukraine successfully defends themselves. Dramatic changes coming from the West or anything like that?
This is a tough question because I only think that the absolute transformation would come from an unequivocal defeat. Like really defeated. Like a government collapse, like border. I'm not saying like NATO invasion, but it would take some type of systematic failure to get the kind of soul searching that might do that. And I don't see the people surrounding Putin being into the game of soul searching very much. His entourage. I mean, you saw when he asked their opinions when he went to war. The one guy was like trembling. But this, to me, is the question that Russia has. This is my take on it, and people can take it or leave it, because I'm just a professor in history at Ferris State University. There's a historian named Jeffrey Hosking, I think just put it perfectly, that Russia will never be Russia unless it divorces its national identity from the Russian Empire. Too many Russians have this idea that what it means to be great in Russian is the fact that they have an empire and some type of control, or first among equals, to quote Orwell, among the people around them. So if you can get rid of that idea that you need an empire or some type of unequal relationship with your neighbors, because even the demands that Putin gave to avoid the war this time around were just basic. You could look right at them and say they want to establish another sphere of influence in Eastern Central Europe. And people, there's a line of thinkers that I showed you on the board. They see like a democratic liberal order as violating their whole entire understanding of what makes Russia better and greater than America. It's tough to change identity. It's tough to change how you view the world. So to my mind, unless you have an idea that Russia is just going to be a country struggling to economically develop and raise its standard of living through peaceful commerce, to kind of the broadly defined liberal order, until that happens, I think there's going to be trouble. But to me, I'm willing to listen to you. How do you get people to change the way they conceive of how their country should be in the world? America has a hard time doing it too. Yeah.
China. What are they waiting to see what happens? They're kind of the quiet giant waiting to do something probably.
China would like nothing better than for Russia to end the war now. I'm convinced of it. They're nervous. They're not giving Russia a lot of military support. Behind the scenes, they're benefiting quite a bit from buying cheap Russian oil. But from my reading of the Chinese, like they've got bigger fish to fry. They're not seeing what Russia's doing as that conducive to their desire to build this authoritarian, more friendly authoritarian world order together. It's it's making them uncomfortable. Because I guarantee you, Putin said something similar to the Chinese government, that he pretty much broadcast that Ukraine would fold like a deck of cards. When he got permission from China, it had to be. I can't imagine otherwise. People have always speculated about this, but he had to say, this will be over in like a month. This artificial state, their wannabe. You've got this elite that is bamboozling the people, but the people are just, they want to be Russians, the Russian bear. And so they're probably like, okay, go ahead. And it clearly hasn't worked out. I mean, the Chinese don't like disorder. So to my mind, I think they're looking at it, they're going to take advantage of the cheap oil, but I think behind the scenes they're telling the Russians, you've got to figure this out. And I think that's probably one of the reasons Putin may try to up the military a little bit now, is because he knows time is slipping somewhat. But I think China is going to have a second thought now about invading Taiwan. Everyone's worried about Taiwan right now. I think that China is like, I think it's going to give them more pause than you would have before the invasion. To me, but once again, to me, you can get into these debates about what China's thinking, but I'd be surprised if they started something with Taiwan in the near future. Yes. The Russian elite?
Yes.
Well, it.
Historically, can you take us through? When was the elite the one that, at any point in time, divorced itself from the imperial concept in a more traditional or a more transcendent way? In other words, that it remained at least in the realm of culture and what they consider, to be a tradition along, Russian.
Well, we can go through Russia. I mean, a lot of the best times of reform for Russia has been after losing wars. I mean, you have like the Crimean War, then the Russo-Japanese War. But to me, when I say elite, I mean the cronies surrounding Putin that he pays off. I mean, not only the yes men in the government, but the oligarchs, as they're called, who are gallivanting around the world. So to my mind, it would be that crowd. It would be, in a broader sense, the government officials that he's put around him, the yes men. But I would also say on some of the elite would be the Western educated, the Western or in some level influenced people in the Moscow area who want to send their kids to like Oxford and who want to like be part of this. And there's plenty of Russians at Oxford, this. So to be part of like the whole kind of broad transatlantic world. I mean, to my mind, when I say they're going to rebel, to my mind, it would be a brain drain. People just leaving, not coming back, like getting out of the country. I doubt how many people who are making, let's say, an upper middle class to upper class existence in the Moscow or the Moscow suburbs want their Johnny or Jill fighting. Even they won't draft women, Putin won't, but fighting against Ukraine. To me, I don't know. I can go on, but to me, the stuff I'm hearing out of Russia is all over the place. Some people are terrified. Some people, we have professors now at Ohio State who used to live in Russia. She said a lot of her friends and relatives there believe Putin. They're at least when they talk to her, they're all on board. I mean, to my mind, I think Tim Snyder's idea of politics of inevitability are useful here because I think a lot of Americans have assumed that if you just let the process go, most people will figure out that our system of government's better, the way we do things is better. It's a takeoff Fukuyama's end of history thesis. That's a misunderstood argument. But there is the sense in America, that even under Obama, that eventually everything was moving in the right direction and the things are bad and people will figure this out. But I think Russia said, no, we can poke holes in that. We can get people on our side to question what people in the West take for granted. And now I think they've made a lot of inroads. And they're making inroads with politicians in the West as well. Le Pen in France, for example. So I think we have to be, this will be my last point. We have to get into the cheerleading business for liberal democracy and really try to explain why it's better and how it can help not just Westerners, but other people do better in this world.
Realizing that this is a full-out attack
Mm-hmm.
on the Western civilization.
That's what I take it as. I agree with you.
You know, I mean, the Kremlin playbook is out there for quite some time, but no one seems to take it seriously.
Yeah, I agree. But I'm supposed to stop talking, so. Why am I clapping?